Regarding the outline of this presentation, I shall first say a few words about the French situation regarding vaccine hesitancy in general, but also by addressing human papillomavirus, so we say HPV vaccination. And I will then try to analyze patient-doctor interactions, first from the point of view of mothers and daughters, and then from that of providers. Finally, I will present some recent data on the determinants of providers' behaviors in HPV vaccination. So first of all, what about the French general context? It is marked, as you understood, by the multiplication of vaccination-related controversies over the past decades, and during the current health crisis too. These controversies have led to a growing distrust of the French people focusing on the real or alleged side effects of vaccines. This mistrust in the French population has largely contributed to insufficient vaccine coverage, as for HPV vaccine, and to the resurgence of epidemics of measles, for example. So the government, the former President François Hollande, thus decided in 2017 to extend mandatory early childhood vaccination. This measure was not applied to vaccine of adolescents, however. What about vaccination against HPV in France? It is mainly performed by general practitioners and also partly by pediatricians for the youngest teens and also by gynecologists. The year 2014 and perhaps the period 2011-2014 was a turning point in this vaccination, as has already been explained by Mr. Didier Reichmuller. Yes, during this period, we could see a mobilization of part of the medical community that signed a petition to the health ministry demanding a parliamentary investigation into HPV vaccine. The signatories questioned, among other things, the vaccination strategy itself, considering that it could weaken the cervical cancer screening strategy. The same year, several young girls with severe neurological diseases diagnosed after HPV vaccination filed lawsuits blaming the vaccine for their diseases. I won't describe the impact of vaccine coverage because during the previous presentation this was done, so I will skip directly to the next slide. The impact of this controversy was reflected in a significant increase in unfavorable opinions of this vaccine in 2016 among the general population, measured in comparing the results of two health barometers, one in 2010 and the other in 2016. A large national survey by Santé Publique France that is repeated regularly. Most importantly, it is at the bottom of the slide. This impact was reflected in an unfavorable or uncertain perception of the benefit-risk balance of these vaccines by nearly 2/3 of parents of young adolescent girls. A pronounced and lasting vaccine hesitancy has thus developed in the French population with respect to this vaccine. I come now to patient-provider interaction. patient-provider interaction represents the cornerstone of maintaining confidence in vaccination and addressing vaccine hesitancy. Numerous studies indicate that for multiple vaccines, that physicians' recommendations have a strong impact on their patients' vaccination behavior. It is a fact constantly observed for decades that the French population highly trusts doctors, and especially family doctors. A recent study carried out by the University of Nancy and the London School of Economics have shown that 92% of French people trust their doctor to tell them the truth about COVID-19. The high level of trust is built as part of a close personal and face-to-face doctor-patient relationship. But it is also the result of another process. Trust in doctors is often also the result of patients' commitment of resources, time, networks, to find the doctor who best fits them. How do mothers of young girls perceive their role in HPV vaccination? Interviews conducted in 2014 with mothers from different socioeconomic categories had shown that they mostly want to be actors of their decision, with the most hesitant ones documenting themselves the most. Several external factors could disrupt the decision-making process. First, being exposed to the media controversies. This instills doubt in medical discourse and can stop a vaccination in progress. Then, searching for information on the internet. Although the internet is perceived as unreliable or even alarming, it can also maintain doubt in mothers' mind. And finally, being confronted with conflicting opinions from different doctors when several are consulted, which often happens in France, is also an important problem. More recent interviews and focus groups conducted in the Paris region by Emily Karafilakis showed that for young girls, the mother was the main decision maker. On the mother's side, the interview showed a very high level of trust in their doctors, so much so that some mothers could delegate vaccination decision to their doctor. However, some nuances must be made. Mothers were sensitive to the doctor's attitude, and they valued doctors who listened to them and explained or advised rather than pressure. Another aspect, what the doctor did for their own children was also important for mothers, confirming the doctor role model. However, sometimes mothers avoided talking to their doctors about their hesitations for fear of being judged negatively. Finally, the interviews also show that some mothers do not vaccinate their daughters because their family doctors has not recommended the vaccine or recommended against it. This last point highlights that providers' opinions about HPV vaccination may vary. It is therefore critical to assess how much providers may be affected by uncertainties. And we did so in 2 surveys of GPs in 2014 and again in 2020 in 2 panels of GPs. The results on this slide indicate many things. First, that the percentage of physicians reported that they regularly recommend this vaccine increased from 72% in 2014 to 82% in 2020. Some markers of vaccine hesitancy among physicians decreased markedly, such as the view that children are vaccinated against too many diseases. I'm speaking about views of HCPs and here GPs. I would like to stress this. The percentage of physicians expressing this fell from 20% to 5%. Finally, whereas in 2014, 60% of GPs were reserved about the risks of HPV vaccine, and a quarter doubted its effectiveness, in 2020, a very large majority considered its benefit-risk balance favorable, 86% on this slide. Qualitative interviews with 28 GPs, pediatricians, and gynecologists in 2017 suggest 3 types of attitudes of these physicians regarding HPV vaccination. We have labeled them favorable physician, the most numerous, skeptics, and hesitants. The favorable ones considered that the only acceptable attitude for a physician is to be pro-vaccine and pro-HPV vaccine. Those who are not are seen as anti-vax and irrational doctors. The skeptics did not consider themselves as anti-vax. They said they were in favor of vaccination in general, but criticized the lack of transparency of health authorities and considered that pap smear is more important and feasible than HPV vaccination. And finally, the hesitants, unlike the 2 previous groups with strong convictions, had difficulty forming an opinion. They felt lost, ill-informed, and confused by the controversies. The physicians interviewed also behaved in very different ways with patients. A third tried to proactively convince the mothers. This is on the left side of this slide, stressing the importance of their educational role, but also of patient consent. In contrast, on the right side of the slide, a minority refused to discuss or debate with vaccine-reluctant patients. Finally, in the middle, the majority adapted to the mothers, informing them about HPV vaccination more often on the patient's request than on their own initiative, and then letting the patients decide. Given these results, it is useful to ask what are the determinants of physicians' behavior with their patients. And in our 2020 quantitative survey, we found the following. 7 GPs out of 10 trust the Ministry of Health to provide reliable information on the risks and benefits of vaccines. But less than half thought that the Ministry of Health is not influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. Almost 9 out of 10 felt comfortable discussing vaccines with patients reluctant to vaccination. And 2/3 considered that patients who are hesitant about vaccination have legitimate concerns. And finally, 1 in 5 physicians reported it reported that it is I'm sorry. I start again. 1 in 5 physicians reported it is counterproductive to try to convince patients to get vaccinated, a proportion close to that observed in the previous qualitative study. In this study, in this quantitative study in 2020, we also quantified the relationship between the preceding, let's say, factors and the behavior, that is, the frequency of HPV vaccination recommendation by GPs to their patients, which is a dependent variable. The results indicate that while GPs' vaccine trust, commitment, and self-efficacy, and trust in institutions are positive predictors of routine HPV vaccine recommendation, being open to mother's concerns is instead associated with less frequent recommendation behavior. This suggests that patients' concern may also influence physicians' behavior. I come now to my conclusion with some difficulty. I will end this presentation with some remarks or perspectives. First of all, it is essential to review the place of vaccination in the training of HCPs, which several studies indicate it is not optimal. To ensure more solid knowledge of HCPs, naturally, but also to allow them to acquire the skills necessary to address patients with vaccine hesitancy. In terms of results, more work is needed to better understand the dynamics of patient-provider interaction and to evaluate the impact of HCPs training on their attitudes, practice, and skills. In particular, it would be important to evaluate the feasibility and impact of training in education methods, some of which, such as motivational interviewing, have been shown to have great potential. Thank you very much for your attention.